Chapter 21 Poor Child. You are listening at novelful.audio. Isn't that Bai Ruozhu, her uncle's youngest? What happened? Why are you getting picked on like that? Bai Ruozhu called out, Xiaoxi, what's going on? Even if she wasn't a fan of Bai Ba, kids were kids, and now, pregnant herself, she felt even more protective. Bai Ruozhu finally looked up, just once, then went back to looking distant. Whose kid is this? Go on, get out of here, or I'll tell your parents. Bai Ruozhu yelled. The other kids, a little scared of grown-ups, scattered, laughing as they ran. She remembered her former self barely knowing this little cousin. He was quiet, kept to himself. When Bai Hong's family split off, Bai Ruozhu was still a baby, and they hadn't kept in touch much since, but looking at Bai Ruozhu now, Bai Ruozhu felt a pang of sympathy. The kid was clearly under the weather. She reached out to take his hand. He resisted at first, but then let her. Bai Ruozhu sighed in relief. Okay, it wasn't too serious. How about we go down to the river and wash your face? Bai Ruozhu asked gently. Bai Ruozhu's eyes flickered, finally settling on her face. Why didn't you ask? Bai Ruozhu paused, realizing he meant why she didn't ask why he'd been getting beat up. He probably got that a lot, and clearly wasn't in the mood to talk about it. If you want to tell me, you will. If not, why should I pry? Besides, I kinda know already, even if you don't. Bai Ruozhu chuckled, then reached out and patted Bai Ruozhu's head. Her hand came back covered in mud. She grimaced. And the mud kinda stank. Like pee. Luckily, Bai Ruozhu shuffled his feet and followed her to the river. Bai Ruozhu, clumsy with her pregnancy, just washed her hands. Bai Ruozhu washed his own face and head, pretty efficiently. When he was done, Bai Ruozhu pulled out a piece of candy from her pocket, handed it to him, and said, Here. It's from your sister. She'd bought it in town, craving sweets with the pregnancy. She'd only eaten 2 out of the bag. Bai Ruozhu didn't hesitate this time, his eyes a little less dull. He took the candy and popped it in his mouth. After a moment, he looked at Bai Ruozhu. Sweet. Bai Ruozhu smiled, patting his head. She pulled out another piece, wanting it herself, but saw Bai Ruozhu staring at the candy in her hand, his eyes wide and hopeful. She hesitated, then reluctantly gave it to him. She was a foodie, for crying out loud. Bai Ruozhu took the candy, but didn't eat it right away. He looked left and right, then broke the candy in half, handing the bigger piece to Bai Ruozhu. Here, you eat it. He kept it simple, no room for argument. Bai Ruozhu happily took the candy and put it in her mouth. He wasn't a bad kid at all, just kind of withdrawn. Maybe a little autistic. But hopefully things would be okay now that they'd met. Okay, let's head home. Don't tell anyone you saw me. I'll get you some more candy in a few days, Bai Ruozhu said, smiling. Bai Ruozhu didn't speak, but nodded firmly. But you gotta promise me that if you get picked on again, you run away. Don't just stand there and get beat up, or I won't give you any candy. Bai Ruozhu felt like a weirdo, using candy to bribe some innocent young lady. It's just for his own good. Bai Ruozhu nodded again, just as seriously. Relieved, Bai Ruozhu turned toward home. After a few steps, she saw that Bai Ruozhu was still following her. Aren't you going back to your place? She asked. This time, Bai Ruozhu didn't answer, didn't even seem to hear her. He just kept on her heels. Bai Ruozhu sighed and turned toward her place. Lin Pinger was surprised to see Bai Ruozhu, pulling Bai Ruozhu aside to ask what was going on. After Bai Ruozhu's quick explanation, Lin Pinger's eyes softened. Poor little thing. Bring him to eat with us. Thank you, Bai Ruozhu replied, still without expression, but his voice wasn't quite so flat. The Bai family were kind-hearted folks. Knowing Xiaoxi had been getting bullied, nobody objected to him joining them for dinner. During the meal, they even made sure he got enough to eat. By the end of the meal, Xiaoxi's eyes were a little brighter. Thank you, he said again. Then he turned and left the Bai's place. "Oh, it's so sad, a child ending up like that," Lin Ping'er said, wiping the corners of her eyes. Bai Ruozhu was curious. "Mom, I don't even know what happened to Xiaoxi." Lin Ping'er glanced toward the door and lowered her voice. "You wouldn't. They kept it quiet. Didn't want anyone talking about it." So, the family listened to Lin Ping'er's story. Bai Ziqing, or Xiaoxi, had always been a bright kid, but with one weakness: he loved food. And he was a sneaky little thing, always finding the good stuff, like the preserved stuff Grandma Bai hid, the New Year's treats, the occasional fish or meat. No matter how hard Grandma hid it, he'd sniff it out. They always said he had a dog's nose. But Grandma was a stingy old woman. Used to the second son on the farm eating like a horse, she hated that Xiaoxi was always sneaking food, so, one time, after Xiaoxi stole some food, the old woman got angry and whacked him with a spatula. She hit him on the head, hard, and the kid started convulsing and foaming at the mouth. After that, he was never the same. Didn't pay much attention, didn't talk much, didn't smile. Some folks say he's simple, but I don't think so. Does a simpleton have such bright eyes? Lin Ping'er said. Bai Ruozhu nodded. You're right, Mom. Xiaoxi's smart. He just got beat so badly he doesn't want to deal with people anymore. The rest of the Bai family didn't quite get Bai Ruozhu's explanation, settling for the idea that something was wrong with his head. Didn't his mom go after Grandma? Bai Ziho asked. He'd always thought Grandma was stingy, but he didn't realize she could be so cruel. Lin Ping'er rolled her eyes. Your grandma slipped your aunt some money, and they kept it quiet. I only found out because I happened to walk past the kitchen. Your aunt didn't do much. The kid was still sick, so she just pocketed the cash and got some new clothes. Bai Ruozhu remembered the last time she saw Wang. Her clothes were nice and new. Made her feel sick. Wang was a terrible mother, Bai Yihong sighed. From now on, don't turn Xiaoxi away if he comes to eat. We can afford it. But the next day, Xiaoxi didn't come. Bai Ruozhu was worried, and she checked around the village, asking the other kids. Nobody had seen Xiaoxi out playing. Bai Ruozhu didn't want to go to the old house, so she started for home. In the distance, she saw a carriage parked in front of her house. Had some fancy relative come to visit? Chapter 22 Master Negotiator. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When the carriage pulled up to the Bai house, Lin Ping'er was in the yard, picking vegetables. She glanced up, and for a split second, she thought it was Changsheng. She dropped the vegetables and practically ran to the gate. She was so excited she almost tripped. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the latch. If Changsheng was back, her daughter wouldn't be a widow, her child would have a father, and the village gossip would finally die down. But as the carriage door swung open, a young man stepped out. Handsome, sure, but definitely not her husband. Lin Ping'er's heart sank. Disappointment plain on her face, she completely forgot her manners. Du Zhongshu, stepping out of the carriage, saw the gate open and a young woman approaching. Judging by her age, she had to be Bai Ruozhu's mother. He frowned. Why did she look so bummed out to see him? He instinctively touched his nose. What was going on? Was Bai Ruozhu still mad at him? Ma'am, I'm here to see Bai Ruozhu, Du Zhongshu said, bowing politely to Lin Ping'er. Snapping out of it, Lin Ping'er replied, Ruozhu's not here. Who are you? That just then, Bai Ziho popped his head out, spotted Du Zhongshu, and charged out, planting himself between his mother and the visitor. What are you doing here? Looking for trouble? Bai Ziho puffed out his chest, trying to look tough. The boy with Du Zhongshu took a step back, thinking, man, this kid's got some serious attitude. Du Zhongshu, noticing the gathering crowd of villagers, just gave a sheepish smile. Hey, man, let's talk inside. Bai Ziho glanced around. Okay, Du Zhongshu only brought one guy. What could they do? He nodded. Bai Ruozhu was out of the house, discussing the new school with the village chief. That left Lin Pinger and her two sons. Bai Zipei, who had been studying inside, came out to see what the commotion was about. Lin Pinger had already ushered Du Zhongshu into the main room. Bai Zipei saw a young man in a blue robe sitting stiffly on a stool. He looked so clean and refined that Bai Zipei was worried he'd stain his clothes. He was surprised to learn the visitor was there to see his little sister. By the time Bai Ruozhu got home, Du Zhongshu had already introduced himself and explained his visit. She stared at Du Zhongshu sipping tea in her house. He looked so out of place. Why was he really here? To apologize? Nah, he's probably too arrogant for that. Then it hit her. There was only one possibility. When Du Zhongshu saw Bai Ruozhu, he jumped up and gave a respectful bow. His refined manners impressed Bai Zipei. He really seemed like a gentleman from a wealthy family. Du Zhongshu, you didn't come back to get even for me yelling at you the other day, did you? Bai Ruozhu asked, playing dumb and glaring at him. Sure enough, Du Zhongshu's face flushed. Mrs. Bai, you misunderstand. I've been thinking a lot since then, and you were right. I haven't been ambitious enough. I wanted to talk to you again about the toothpaste. Bai Ruozhu rolled her eyes. Opportunities don't always wait around, you know. I'm not interested in selling you the toothpaste anymore. She secretly enjoyed the look of embarrassment on Du Zhongshu's face. Was she turning into a bossy meanie, picking on the young and cute? The boy with Du Zhongshu lost it. Hey, you rude country woman. My young master came all the way here to be polite. What more do you want? Bai Ruozhu gave him a cold stare. Oh, you're the one who took the wrong medicine, right? I don't want anything. I said I'm not selling. The boy turned red. He sputtered, but Du Zhongshu cut him off. Zhou Fu, behave yourself. The boy pouted and stepped back. So, are you the bad cop? He's the good cop. Bai Ruozhu asked, all wide-eyed innocence. Du Zhongshu coughed awkwardly. This woman was tough. He bowed again, even lower this time, practically groveling. The Bai family was stunned. Was Mr. Du a pushover, or was their Ruozhu just that powerful? Bai Ruozhu figured she'd pushed him far enough. She stood up, cradling her belly, and asked slowly, so, Mr. Du, how did you envision this cooperation? Du Zhongshu perked up, sensing an opening. He jumped to his feet. You provide the recipe, the Du Family Medical Center will manufacture it, and you'll get 20% of the monthly profits. After Bai Ruozhu's dressing down, he didn't dare lowball her. He laid it all out, but he didn't see the surprised look on Bai Ruozhu's face, and he started to feel uneasy. Was she going to try to squeeze him for more? Just for the recipe? 20% is too much. I'd feel guilty taking it, Bai Ruozhu said casually. Oh. Du Zhongshu was stumped. What was she thinking? I'll give you the recipe and take care of improving and developing the toothpaste. I can keep giving you better recipes. You can make regular toothpaste for mass market or high-end toothpaste for customers who want the best. Plus, I'll give you sales tips, advice. Bai Ruozhu's lips curved into a smile. Now that should be worth 30%, right? Du Zhongshu was speechless. Then, he clapped his hands together. Mrs. Bai, you're a brilliant negotiator. Bai Ruozhu just smiled, a confident, radiant smile that made her eyes sparkle. The whole Bai family was blown away. They'd never seen her so self-assured, so dazzling. They all turned to Du Zhongshu, waiting for his answer. Du Zhongshu lowered his head, thinking hard. Finally, he looked up. I need to know, how much better can this toothpaste get? Bai Ruozhu held up 2 fingers. Her fingers were a little swollen from pregnancy, but it didn't detract from her looks. If anything, they looked softer, rounder. 20%. Du Zhongshu asked, frowning. Bai Ruozhu shook her head. Twice as much. Du Zhongshu's eyes widened. How could it get that much better? What I'm making now is a basic version. I have limited ingredients and I have to keep costs down, or regular folks won't buy it. Once the toothpaste gets a reputation, we can make it even more effective. If it's more effective, people will pay more for it. Bai Ruozhu said calmly. Chapter 23 The Speculations of the Villagers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Until Du Zhongshu said his goodbyes, the Bai family was still reeling. Lin Ping'er watched him go and asked Bai Ruozhu, "Honey, should we see him off?" "Nah, forget the formalities. We'll be seeing plenty of him," Bai Ruozhu said, smiling. She patted her belly, her face glowing like a well-fed, happy little fox. Bai Ziho, still in shock, turned to Bai Ruozhu. "Sis, do really agree to that? What's this 30% deal?" Bai Ruozhu grinned. "Say Du's clinic makes 100 taels bonus this month. I get 30. If they rake in 1,000 taels, I get 300. A collective gasp filled the room. 300 taels could cover the family's expenses for years, and that was just for 1 month. Bai Ruozhu chuckled inwardly. If 300 taels was a shock, they were in for a wild ride. 1,000 taels? Lin Ping'er asked, stunned. Is that even possible? Bai Ruozhu just smiled, radiating confidence. Lin Ping'er and Bai Ziho were still processing, but Bai Zipei, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke. "Mom, brother, if our little sister says it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen." Bai Zipei, the most educated in the family, carried weight. Lin Ping'er and Bai Ziho took his word for it. Bai Ruozhu was touched by her brother's faith in her. She gave him a grateful smile and saw him subtly purse his lips. She understood instantly. Bai Zipei's mouth ulcers and gum inflammation were a constant problem. He knew firsthand how amazing her toothpaste was. Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Bai Yihong, home from his evening out. Bai Yihong had a bit of a buzz. The village chief had invited him to dinner and toasted him in front of the elders, even asking his opinion on opening a school. Luckily, his daughter had given him some talking points. His suggestions were a hit, and everyone sang his praises. He had celebrated with a couple of extra drinks, but he knew his limits and held his liquor well. Since he was a kid, the family's money had gone to his older brother's education. He'd pitched in early, feeding pigs, gathering firewood, working the fields. But no matter how hard he worked, his parents always valued his brother more. His actions never carried as much weight as his brother's words. In the village, his brother was seen as a promising scholar. He was just steady. He never held a grudge. He figured it was his lot in life. And maybe he wasn't cut out for academics anyway, but recently, he'd suddenly become the center of attention. The village chief and elders praised his good sense and quick thinking. Even the other villagers treated him with newfound respect. He knew it was all thanks to his daughter. Ever since she'd stood up to Lu San's wife and given up her fixation on immortality, she'd become so much more lively and sharp. He thought about it and realized his daughter was the family's real treasure. "Mom, on the way back, I heard people saying we had a fancy visitor. Is Auntie back?" Bai Yihong asked, pleased. Auntie was Bai Yihong's older sister, Bai Yun. Because she was the daughter of a scholar, she married into a family in Beiyu City. Bai Yun rarely came back to Househan village after getting married. Usually, she'd visit once a year, if that. But in those days, women were expected to stay with their husbands, especially those who lived far away. Lin Ping'er waved him over. "Honey, come on in and let's talk." Once he was inside, Lin Ping'er quickly filled him in about Du Zhongshu's visit and their cooperation plans. Bai Yihong's eyes lit up. The wine buzz vanished instantly, but his brow furrowed, and he turned to Bai Ruozhu. "Daughter, is that recipe really worth 30% of the bonus?" Bai Ruozhu knew her dad was a straight shooter. His first thought wasn't about how much money they'd make, but whether they deserved that much. He was a man who knew his place. "Dad, don't worry. This toothpaste has a lot of potential. I'm not exaggerating. It's gonna make the Du family a fortune." They'll be thanking us later, Bai Ruozhu said with a smile. Well, all right then. Relieved, Bai Yihong grinned. Our Ruozhu is getting more and more capable. You're our family's female Zhuge. Lin Pinger took Bai Ruozhu's hand. My daughter's always been smart. Haven't you noticed? She said proudly. Yeah, she gets her brains from you, Bai Yihong said cheerfully. The whole family laughed, happy and content. Finally, Bai Ruozhu told everyone not to breathe a word about their deal with the Du family. She didn't want to stir up jealousy, everyone agreed. If the folks at the old house found out, they'd make a scene and try to get a piece of the action. They were trouble enough as it was. When Du Zhongshu left, he'd said he'd find a middleman to draw up a contract. Once it was ready, he'd have Bai Ruozhu sign it. With a contract in black and white, there was no way the Du family could weasel out of paying the dividends. However, Bai Ruozhu kept something to herself. If the profits became huge, the Du family would inevitably get greedy. It was human nature. Even if Du Zhongshu was a good man, that didn't mean everyone in his family was. She knew that to protect her interests, a contract wasn't enough. She needed to have enough power to prevent anyone from cheating, deceiving, or plotting against her. The apricots in the village were ripening, so Bai Ruozhu planned to make preserved apricots with her friend Feng Guizhi. When Feng Guizhi arrived, she brought some interesting news. Ruozhu, there's been a lot of talk in the village lately. They're saying. Feng Guizhi paused, hesitant. Bai Ruozhu already knew what was coming. They're saying we had a fancy visitor who came in a carriage. What else? Feng Guizhi nodded. They think it was your parents coming back. They're saying you met some important people and you're not who you used to be anymore. Bai Ruozhu was speechless. She knew the villagers would speculate about Du Zhongshu's identity, but she never expected them to mistake him for an immortal. It was ridiculous. Then it hit her. Her father had rescued Changsheng when he was unconscious, but he didn't know who he was. Seeing that he was too good-looking, he kept telling him to darken his face. During the fight, Lu San's wife had also mentioned Changsheng being dark, so the villagers didn't know what he looked like now, but Du Zhongshu was fair-skinned. How did they connect the two? Chapter 24. You must know how to fight. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Feng Guizhi watched Bai Ruozhu, a question on her face. After a moment, she ventured, Ruozhu, is it really your folks who came back to visit? Bai Ruozhu snapped her head up, a bright smile spreading across her face. Guess. She teased. Feng Guizhi was a little taken aback. Sure, Bai Ruozhu had gained weight from the pregnancy, her face rounder than before. But Feng Guizhi thought she looked even prettier. She couldn't quite put her finger on why, but Bai Ruozhu's eyes sparkled now, so lively, and her smile was as radiant as a summer day. Bai Ruozhu chuckled inwardly. Let the villagers jump to conclusions, she thought. It might keep them from whispering behind her back, always fussing over whether she and Changsheng were really married. They chatted for a bit before getting down to the apricots. Since they needed washing, they hauled the baskets down to the river. Feng Guizhi lugged a heavy basket, but Bai Ruozhu was only allowed to carry a handful of apricots in a small basket. Bai Ruozhu wasn't about to push it. She had to be careful now. Lifting heavy things could bring on premature labor. No sooner had they arrived at the river than they ran into Mrs. Wang from the west end of the village, doing her laundry. Mrs. Wang's eyes lit up when she saw Bai Ruozhu. Ruozhu, honey, you're huge. You shouldn't be out here working like this. Don't overdo it, now. Since Bai Ruozhu had arrived here, she'd been around the village plenty of times. It wasn't like she hadn't met Mrs. Wang before. It was just that Mrs. Wang had never been this friendly. Bai Ruozhu secretly rolled her eyes, but her face wore a smile. Thanks for your concern, Aunt Wang. I'm fine. Just heading home after this. She cut off the conversation and winked at Feng Guizhi, and the two of them busied themselves washing the apricots. Mrs. Wang was practically bursting with curiosity. But since Bai Ruozhu was avoiding eye contact, she couldn't easily press her. Finally, when Bai Ruozhu and Fang Guizhi were almost finished, Mrs. Wang couldn't contain herself any longer. "Ruozhu, dear, I heard you had some big shot visiting you a few days ago." Bai Ruozhu turned and smiled, but gave nothing away. "Oh, so it was your parents back for a visit? Then why'd they leave so soon?" Mrs. Wang had the word gossip plastered all over her face. Bai Ruozhu simply smiled, then clutched her forehead. "Fang Guizhi, I'm feeling a little dizzy. Let's head back." Fang Guizhi caught Bai Ruozhu's wink and barely managed to stifle a laugh. She knew Bai Ruozhu was fed up with Mrs. Wang's prying. She grabbed her basket. "No problem, let's go." Then, turning back to Mrs. Wang, she said, "We'll catch you later, Mrs. Wang." "Gotta run." That they made a quick exit, leaving Mrs. Wang with a frustrated look on her face, unable to get a word in edgewise. She looked as anxious as a cat on a hot tin roof. "You were way too nice to that Mrs. Wang," Fang Guizhi grumbled as they walked away. "You never smile that much at anyone." Bai Ruozhu brushed it off. "Hey, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Better to be on her good side than make an enemy. Saves us trouble down the road." Fang Guizhi looked at Bai Ruozhu with surprise. She spoke in a softer tone, "Ruozhu, I've noticed you've become a lot calmer since you got pregnant." Bai Ruozhu touched her belly. It wasn't that her previous life was bad, but some scholars could be aloof and easily offend people in this rural place. She didn't want to keep up that old persona. She wasn't the snobby type to begin with, so why force it? "When you're having a baby, you've got more to worry about," Bai Ruozhu said softly. "You'll understand when you have one." Her eyes were tender, full of affection for the little gymnast flipping around inside her. Fang Guizhi's face flushed, and she glared at Bai Ruozhu. "If you keep talking like that, I'm not talking to you anymore." "I'm not even engaged yet," Bai Ruozhu chuckled. The young women of this era were so innocent, so easily embarrassed. What was there to be ashamed of after getting married and having a baby? What woman didn't get married and have a baby? But then Fang Guizhi's expression clouded over. She murmured, "With my mom being the way she is, I don't even know where I'll end up marrying." Fang Guizhi's mother favored her son and had always planned on trading Fang Guizhi for her son's bride. Bai Ruozhu gently took Fang Guizhi's hand. "Guizhi, we should respect our parents, sure, but we also have to live our own lives. Put aside some money for yourself, so you have a little security in the future. And..." She lowered her voice. "If you're not happy with the marriage they arrange, you need to fight back. And I'll help you." Fang Guizhi was visibly moved. She stared at Bai Ruozhu, feeling inexplicably that Bai Ruozhu, with her bright, knowing eyes, could actually help her. She sniffed. "Ruozhu, thank you." Bai Ruozhu chuckled, looking at Fang Guizhi's red nose. She looked like a little kitten. Bai Ruozhu couldn't resist reaching out and ruffling her hair. In her eyes, Fang Guizhi was just a kid. A 16-year-old was still in high school these days, cherished by her parents. Fang Guizhi pulled away, annoyed. "Why do you always treat me like a child?" They were the same age. Why did Bai Ruozhu act like a big sister? Bai Ruozhu had lived to 26 in her previous life. Wasn't she a big sister to the 16-year-old Fang Guizhi? They chatted as they worked, and the time flew by. At noon, Lin Ping'er invited Fang Guizhi to stay for lunch. Fang Guizhi quickly waved her hand. "I have to get back and cook." "Thanks anyway, auntie." Then she hurried off. Fang Guizhi didn't eat enough and was a little thin, but she was strong. Watching her run, Bai Ruozhu thought she looked like a deer in the mountains, so graceful. During lunch, Bai Yihong said with a worried expression, "I don't know what's going on in the village. Everyone's saying Changsheng is back. Does that young master from the Du family even look like Changsheng?" Lin Ping'er shook her head. "Not at all. They didn't get a good look and they're just guessing. I'll try to set the record straight when I go out later." "These rumors are getting out of hand," Bai Yihong said with a frown. Dad! Bai Ruozhu stopped him. Let the villagers talk and guess. Let's play it coy. Don't say yes or no. If they push you, just say you weren't home that day. You don't know what happened. Bai Hong looked at Bai Ruozhu, confused. Isn't that bad? Isn't that lying? Bai Ruozhu laughed. Where's the lie? You didn't say it was Chongqing, and you weren't home that day. Chapter 25. The baby is greedy. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Then why not just say it's not about immortality? Bai Hong asked, frowning. And if people ask who's coming? What are they doing at our place? What will you say then? Bai Ruozhu shook her head, exasperated. Some things only need a few words to get completely twisted. Let's just not involve Mr. Du. Lin Pinger chimed in, Master, don't be dense. Do you want the whole village knowing Ruozhu signed a contract with someone? The old man will never let us hear the end of it. Everyone in the family, including Bai Zipei, agreed with Bai Ruozhu. He said coolly, less is more. Let the villagers guess. Bai Hong was at a loss. Seeing his daughter's determined look, he figured maybe listening to her was the right call. Du Zhongshu, thrilled, had already had the contract drawn up. He called his boy Zhou Fu to get the carriage ready. He was headed to Haoshan village to pick up Bai Ruozhu and take her to the town's Chamber of Commerce to sign the deal. Having the Chamber of Commerce oversee a private business contract meant that if one party broke the agreement, the other could seek recourse through the chamber, for a small commission. Of course, Zhou Fu hesitated, his eyes darting around, but he didn't move. What are you waiting for? No dilly-dallying. Mrs. Bai is pregnant. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get her home, Du Zhongshu said, clearly annoyed by the boy's dawdling. Zhou Fu stalled, Sir, maybe I should just pick up Mrs. Bai myself. Save you a trip. Du Zhongshu raised an eyebrow, Hey, since when do you worry about me? Zhou Fu stammered, I wouldn't dare. It's just. I heard some gossip the last time I was in Haoshan village, and I'm worried it'll hurt your reputation. Du Zhongshu perked up, gossip? What kind? Spill. Well, the villagers in Haoshan village are saying that Mrs. Bai's husband married into the family but vanished without a trace. Some even say she got pregnant without even going to court with the guy, Zhou Fu reported, clearly enjoying sharing the juicy tidbits he'd overheard. Nonsense. Her husband is missing, she's carrying his child, and she's working hard to keep her family afloat. She's admirable, not someone to spread rumors about. Besides, I'm a businessman. Cooperation is about profit. What do I care about her personal life? Du Zhongshu scoffed. Young master, that's not what I meant. It's just, her situation is complicated. If you go gallivanting over there to pick her up, people will talk. You might not care, but she'll be the subject of gossip, right? Zhou Fu countered, trying a different angle. Du Zhongshu considered this, nodded, you know what? You're right. You go fetch her, then. Meet me at the Chamber of Commerce entrance. And don't rush her. Be polite to Mrs. Bai, got it? Zhou Fu nodded eagerly. He'd wrangled 30% of the bonus by being the go-between, there was no way he was going to get on his bad side, so, Bai Ruozhu was greeted by the carriage stopping at her door again, but this time only the young boy Zhou Fu and the driver were there. He bowed to Bai Ruozhu, Mrs. Bai, my young master instructed me to take you to the Chamber of Commerce to sign the contract. Bai Ruozhu nodded, thank you. The Bai family had decided that Bai Ruozhu wouldn't go alone. Initially, Lin Pinger was going to accompany her, but it felt awkward to cram too many people into someone else's carriage. So, they settled on her brother, Bai Ziho, who could protect her if anything went sideways. Bai Ruozhu and Bai Ziho climbed into the carriage. Zhou Fu told the driver to get a move on. The carriage lurched forward, faster than the usual ox cart, but Bai Ruozhu felt uneasy. She had never gotten car sick before, but this carriage was too much. Brother, stop. Bai Ruozhu called out, opening the curtain and promptly throwing up. Zhou Fu jumped, ordering the driver to slow down. He cursed himself for forgetting the young master's instructions. Mrs. Bai was pregnant, after all, they needed to take it slow. "Little sister, are you all right?" Bai Ziho asked, concerned by her pale face. He pulled a small packet from his pocket and offered her a piece of malt candy. Bai Ruozhu popped the candy in her mouth, feeling slightly better, and leaned back in the seat. "Mrs. Bai, my apologies. I instructed the driver to slow down," Zhou Fu said, trying to make amends. "It's okay, thank you," Bai Ruozhu replied, her voice clear but weak. Zhou Fu didn't know what she was thinking, and it made him nervous. Actually, Bai Ruozhu didn't blame anyone. She was a bit sensitive due to her pregnancy, and she didn't fault Zhou Fu and the driver for such a minor issue. But seeing the candy in her hand, she couldn't help but smile at her brother. He had secretly bought candy for her, so thoughtful. Farmers rarely bought sugar. They'd buy a few pieces of candy as a treat for their kids during holidays. But Bai Ziho happily spent his own money on her. He really doted on her. "Brother, thank you," Bai Ruozhu whispered. Her mouth was full of sweetness, and her heart was filled with happiness. Being reborn into this family was her greatest blessing. Fortunately, Bai Ruozhu didn't get sick again. The carriage made it to Anyuan town. As they passed the West Market, the smell of wonton filled the air. Bai Ruozhu sniffed and felt a sudden craving. She swallowed hard, a loud gulp escaping her lips. Bai Ziho saw his sister's face and knew exactly what she was thinking. After a moment, he spoke up, "Driver, could you stop the carriage for a moment? My sister threw up earlier and isn't feeling well. I want to get her a bowl of wontons to settle her stomach." Bai Ruozhu looked up at her brother, surprised. He was so thoughtful. Whoever married him would be lucky indeed. "Of course, stopping now," the driver replied. Zhou Fu, still worried about upsetting Bai Ruozhu, was eager to make a good impression. "Hey, brother, you're like a mind reader. How did you know I wanted wontons?" Bai Ruozhu asked quietly. Bai Ziho rolled his eyes playfully. "The sound you made when you swallowed was loud enough for everyone to hear. I couldn't pretend I didn't notice." Bai Ruozhu chuckled, trying to cover her embarrassment. Was it really that loud? She knew she was a foodie, but not that greedy, right? It must be the baby wanting it, not her. The baby inside kicked her, protesting her excuse. Bai Ruozhu smiled and patted her belly. It was easy to blame everything on the baby when you were pregnant, right? Chapter 26: The Embarrassment Caused by Green Onion Leaves. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Bai Ziho hopped out of the carriage and carefully helped his sister down. They walked over and sat at the wonton stand. Zhou Fu, who'd been dawdling along, worried that the young master might be getting impatient. He told the driver, "Head over to the Chamber of Commerce, tell the young master we're here, then come back and pick up Mrs. Bai." Sure enough, Du Zhongshu was pacing in front of the Chamber of Commerce. It wasn't that he was a spoiled brat, he just worried about Bai Ruozhu, being pregnant and all. He figured young Zhou Fu might not be the most attentive escort. He perked up when he finally saw the carriage, but the driver jumped down and said, "Sir, Mrs. Bai's at the market, eating wontons. Brother Zhou Fu wanted me to give you a heads up." Du Zhongshu frowned. Why is she eating at the market? He'd envisioned treating them to a nice meal after the contract signing. She got sick on the way, and when they passed the market, she had a craving for wontons. Pregnant women, you know how it is. My wife was the same way, she couldn't resist a good smell. The driver chuckled. I see, Du Zhongshu said, hopping into the carriage. Let's go find them. Arriving at the market, Du Zhongshu spotted Bai Ruozhu at a wonton stall, carefully blowing on each spoonful. He didn't see any sign of an escort. Just as he was about to greet her, a tall man with a candied hawthorn stick ran over and sat next to her, her older brother, Bai Ziho. Bai Ruozhu's eyes lit up. Wow, you read my mind, Bai Ziho scoffed, you were practically drooling over that candied vendor. Anyone could see that. Seriously, where's this appetite coming from? Du Zhongshu noticed a lot of affection in Bai Ziho's teasing. Gimme, Bai Ruozhu said, not caring about being called greedy. I'm pregnant, it's what we do. Hold your horses. Wontons first, then the hawthorns. Don't want you throwing up again, Bai Ziho said sternly, like a good big brother. Bai Ruozhu pouted. Then why did you buy them so early? Just to torture me. Bai Ziho rolled his eyes. It wasn't on purpose. The guy kept moving further away. I had to grab them or I'd never find him again. Bai Ruozhu giggled. Just one bite. She pleaded, holding up a single finger. Du Zhongshu couldn't help but remember Bai Ruozhu's negotiation tactic at the house, holding up 3 fingers. She hadn't seemed cheap at all, her expression and gestures were etched in his memory. Bai Ziho, worn down by her pestering, reluctantly offered the candied hawthorn, then snatched it back like he was guarding a treasure. Bai Ruozhu bit into the hawthorn, the sugary glaze coating her mouth. Her cheeks puffed out, making her round face even cuter. So sweet and sour. She mumbled. Bai Ziho lightly tapped her on the head. Don't talk with your mouth full. Where are your manners? Bai Ruozhu giggled and went back to eating. Du Zhongshu felt a pang of envy. Is this what it's like for a normal family, he thought. So warm. How long had it been since he'd talked like that with his own sister? The Du household was full of rules. As they got older, they had fewer chances to meet, let alone have her act cute and spoiled like she did as a kid. His other siblings, not from the same mother, were all scheming and vying for the family fortune. He suddenly felt that being a rich kid was pretty boring, it was just more money, really. Master! Master! Zhou Fu came running up. Mrs. Bai and her brother are over there, eating wontons. Bai Ruozhu turned and saw Du Zhongshu standing nearby, his eyes sparkling like he'd been there for a while. She subtly glared at Zhou Fu for spilling the beans. Now he knows I've been watching him, how rude. Du Zhongshu stepped forward and greeted Bai Ruozhu and Bai Ziho. Bai Ziho, now that they were partners, was polite and even stood to return the greeting. Bai Ruozhu stayed seated, self-conscious about her baby bump. Sorry to keep you waiting, she said to Du Zhongshu with a smile. Almost done here. Du Zhongshu saw her bright smile and noticed, a green leaf stuck between her teeth. He nearly burst out laughing, barely managing to hold it in. This is priceless, he thought. Usually, she was so careful about smiling, keeping her lips pursed or covering her mouth. But now, a green leaf. Hilarious. Bai Ruozhu saw the amusement in Du Zhongshu's eyes and wondered what he found so funny. Bai Ziho, who'd also noticed, winked at Bai Ruozhu and nudged her. Hey! Bai Ruozhu's heart sank when she saw the green onion leaves floating in the wontons. She rarely tried to be gracious, and now she'd made a fool of herself. Mortifying. But Bai Ruozhu wasn't some delicate flower. She lowered her head and pretended to keep eating, quickly dislodging the onion leaf. When she finished the last wonton, she carefully licked her teeth to make sure she was presentable. She stood and said, sorry for the wait. All done. Bai Ziho handed her the candied hawthorns. She took them, but noticed the men staring at her. Her appetite vanished. Let's head to the Chamber of Commerce, she said. Sounds good. Hop in the carriage, Du Zhongshu said, ushering the siblings into the carriage, then following, Zhou Fu slapped his forehead and handed an oiled paper bag to Bai Ziho. Mr. Bai, your roasted chestnuts, and the change. Bai Ziho took the chestnuts but waved off the coins. Consider it tea money, he said. Before leaving, Ruozhu had told him he needed to start tipping Zhou Fu for his troubles if he wanted him to keep running errands. Regarding updates, there's a requirement for new books to update at a specific pace. If I push too hard at once, it won't even rank on the recommendation list. So, I'll have to stick to the editor's instructions. Only obedient children will get treats when there are recommendations. I'll add more, and I'll work hard to do so after it's released. What I can promise is at least 3 updates every day. So, please continue to support this work and don't abandon me. Chapter 27 No Reward for No Merit. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Thanks for the bonus, Mr. Bai, Ruozhu said, beaming. Bai Ruozhu stole a glance at his little sister. She was right on the money. Ruozhu's tone was happy, even a little chummy. Just like she said, money talks. Hey, don't sweat the small change, Ruozhu, Bai Ruozhu chimed in before heading out. If you want to stay in touch with Mr. Du down the road, remember he won't always show up in person. He'll probably send that young guy with him to deliver messages. So, be nice to him. Connections are key. Bai Ruozhu was a solid, thoughtful guy, no doubt. He'd studied with their bookish grandpa for years as a kid. But growing up on the farm, he hadn't seen much of the outside world. He didn't always get how things worked, good thing my little sisters got brains, Bai Ruozhu thought, relieved. Without further ado, they hopped in a carriage and headed to the Chamber of Commerce. Du Zhongshu pulled out the contract and showed it to Bai Ruozhu. She scanned it quickly, gave it a once-over, and when she saw nothing fishy, handed it to her brother for a second look. Bai Ruozhu hadn't expected his sister to ask for his opinion. He was kinda thrilled. He took it seriously, practically dissecting every word. After reading it through, he nodded, giving Bai Ruozhu the thumbs up. Without hesitating, Bai Ruozhu signed the contract for the Ukamiya, wrote her name, and pressed her fingerprint with red ink. That's when Du Zhongshu learned Bai Ruozhu's given name. Ruozhu, tough as bamboo, huh? He remembered Ruozhu's words, that Bai Ruozhu was looking for a son-in-law. Too bad her husband had disappeared shortly after they married. But she'd face down the whispers in town with her big belly and come out swinging. Instead of feeling sorry for herself, she was busting her butt for the kid inside her and for her family. Made him wonder what he'd been doing all this time, this young master who'd grown up with a silver spoon. If he'd worked harder, his parents might have it easier in the Du household, right? If he stepped up, maybe his mom wouldn't have to deal with so many awful aunts and do so much sighing. Or maybe, just maybe, his sister would have better options when she got married down the line. Alright, thanks Mr. Du, Bai Ruozhu said, handing over the contract. Du Zhongshu snapped back to reality and quickly signed his name and stamped his fingerprint. The contract was drawn up in duplicate, one for each party. The Chamber of Commerce would keep a record on file and charge a fee to protect the contract each year. Bai Ruozhu carefully dried the contract and tucked it away. Then, the group headed out of the Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Du, here's an early draft with my ideas. Take a look and if anything's unclear, just ask, Bai Ruozhu said, handing Du Zhongshu a folded piece of paper. Du Zhongshu was surprised that Bai Ruozhu had already thought things through. He opened the paper and read it over. His surprise morphed into excitement. These ideas are all yours? Du Zhongshu asked, practically bouncing. Well, I talked it over with my family, she answered smoothly. She wasn't lying, exactly. She really had told her family and asked for their input. Everyone agreed. That counts as a discussion, right? Ukamiya nodded, impressed. The Bai family's got scholar blood, no doubt about it. You're wasting your talents holed up in House Han village. Bai Ruozhu was feeling a little conflicted. He knew what his sister meant by discussing. Her idea had been a hit with the whole family, but that didn't guarantee it would be good in other people's eyes. Now, the young master thought it was gold too. Bai Ruozhu was realizing just how sharp his sister was. He just wished he could contribute more. He regretted not hitting the books harder so he could help his sister. But it wasn't too late. If he put in the effort, he could still make up for lost time. You're too kind, Mr. Du, but my dad still puts a lot of stock in farming, Bai Ruozhu replied with a smile. They were farmers, after all. Right, my bad, Du Zhongshu said sheepishly, looking every bit his 17 or 18 years. Although Du Zhongshu was ready to offer them a meal at a restaurant, Bai Ruozhu held back. "Thank you so much for your kindness, Mr. Du. I've been feeling a bit under the weather lately and I don't have much energy. I just want to head home and rest." Hearing that, Du Zhongshu couldn't insist any longer. He arranged for a carriage to take them back to Househan village. Bai Ruozhu asked the driver to drop them off near the village entrance. She didn't want to make a big show. A ride once or twice was fine, but if they kept showing up in a carriage, the villagers would have something to chew on for weeks. Bai Ziho, ever the thoughtful brother, was worried she'd be too tired. Bai Ruozhu playfully stuck out her tongue. "Brother, are you falling for my act too? I'm fine. I just don't want to take advantage and get a free meal." "Oh, okay. Guess I was worried for nothing." Bai Ziho's tone was a little teasing, but his face was relaxed. He was glad his sister was doing okay. "No free lunch, that's my motto. Once our toothpaste starts making money and we get dividends, then we can treat Mr. Du to dinner. It'll be on us then," Bai Ruozhu said, patting her belly. She was torn. She was a foodie, a pregnant foodie at that. Saying no to good food was like torture, but in the end, good sense won out. She bid farewell and they headed home. Before they even reached their place, they spotted their mom at the door, craning her neck, looking towards the village. She looked relieved to see them. Lin Ping'er practically ran over and grabbed Bai Ruozhu's arm. "Sweetheart, you tired?" Lin Ping'er asked, her voice full of concern. "Mom, I'm not that delicate, don't worry," Bai Ruozhu replied, playfully grabbing her mother's arm. Then, she noticed the white hairs at her mother's temples. Bai Ruozhu's heart sank. Had her mother been more worried lately? It was impossible for her parents not to be stressed about her current situation. The three of them went inside and saw their father and second brother waiting at home. The table was laden with dishes. Bai Ruozhu sniffed the air. She'd been right to skip the restaurant. How could a fancy restaurant beat her mom's cooking? Well, maybe her mom's cooking had improved recently. The Bai family meals had been lighter to prevent swelling, and Bai Ruozhu had added some broth to the dishes for flavor. So, how could it be bad? The family was about to dig in when there was a knock at the door. A shrill voice called out, "Is Ruozhu back? Have you eaten yet?" Chapter 28. The Best Old Lady. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The sound of someone at the door made everyone tense. It was Grandma, angling for a handout. He'd probably grill them about what they had for dinner, and if Ruozhu was home. Ruozhu just knew she wasn't going to get through this meal in peace. Lin Ping'er reacted fastest, jumping up. "Quick, kids, stash the food. Don't let her see it." Bai Ziho and Bai Zapate scrambled to gather the plates. Ruozhu piped up, "Not in the kitchen, hide it in the cupboard in your rooms, quick." Understanding dawned on their faces, and they each grabbed a few plates and disappeared. Seeing the table was mostly cleared, Lin Ping'er headed for the door. Bai Yihong looked uneasy. He glanced at Ruozhu, asking softly, "Honey, is this okay?" "It's for the baby." Ruozhu felt for her dad. This was his own mother, even if she wasn't Ruozhu's. She lowered her voice. "Dad, it's not about being stingy, but we can't afford the trouble." Her seriousness hit home, and Bai Yihong had to agree. He knew his mother's temper all too well, but years of ingrained filial piety still gnawed at him. "Dad, we can always make something special for Grandpa and Grandma later, when it's a holiday or something," Ruozhu offered, trying to soothe him, and he seemed to relax a bit. Just then, old lady Lu barged in behind Lin Ping'er. Her eyes lit up when she spotted Ruozhu, like she'd struck gold. "Well, look who it is. Ruozhu's back. Heard you took a fancy carriage into town today. What was that all about?" Mr. Bai hated her using dialect, but Mrs. Lu couldn't shake the habit. Ruozhu groaned inwardly. She hadn't planned on Zhou Fu parking the carriage right in front of the house like that. She'd told him to avoid the village this time, but someone still saw them. "Nothing much. Just saw the doctor for a checkup, with the baby coming soon. Ruozhu kept her tone even. She didn't think much of this old lady, not even as much as Mr. Bai. Is that any way to talk to your elders? Think you're too good for us now. You're really something. Trying to ditch your grandparents. Mrs. Lu screeched, then turned to Bai Hong, yelling, "Second son, you gonna let her get away with this? What happened to filial piety?" Bai Hong's face turned beet red. "Mom, what are you going on about?" Lin Pinger bristled. "Mom, are you here to start a fight at lunchtime? She's pregnant and needs her rest after eating. Don't go making things up, it'll mess with her appetite. Besides, we're separate families now. We still give you money every month, so don't say we're neglecting you." Mrs. Lu was on shaky ground, and she faltered when Lin Pinger called her out. Plus, she'd picked up on the word eating, and her eyes darted to the table. "Oh, your food must be mighty fine, huh? Second son, I haven't eaten yet. Mind if I join you?" Mrs. Lu didn't wait for an answer. She snatched up Ruozhu's bowl and chopsticks and started shoveling food into her mouth. She ate like she hadn't seen a decent meal in ages, smacking her lips with every bite, the fresh soup powder adding an extra kick to the flavor. Watching Mrs. Lu use her bowl and chopsticks, hearing her slurping up the soup, Ruozhu suddenly felt sick. She bolted for the door, throwing up violently. "Ruozhu! What's wrong? Are you okay?" Lin Pinger rushed to her side, her face etched with worry. Ruozhu frowned, shaking her head. "Mom, I just feel awful. Let's go back to my room so I can rest." The sound of Lu's slurping still ringing in her ears. It was truly disgusting. She was vomiting so violently, and Lu wasn't even affected, continuing to eat. The rest of the family gathered around, but Mrs. Lu was too busy stuffing her face. When she heard Ruozhu say she was going to rest, she grabbed a chopstickful of vegetables and ran after her, bowl in hand. "Ruozhu, hold on. I'm not done asking about that carriage." Mrs. Lu called. Ruozhu rubbed her temples, her voice weak. "Grandma, I'm really not feeling well. Maybe if you paid for a doctor, I could get better and remember what you're talking about." She turned and walked back to her room, ignoring Mrs. Lu's curses. "Hey, you ungrateful brat. Running off before your elders are finished talking." Mrs. Lu kept ranting, and Lin Pinger had finally had enough. She blocked Mrs. Lu's path, shouting, "Mom! Enough! Are you trying to give her a fright? What if you upset the baby? These villagers are all so delicate these days. I was working in the fields when I was pregnant with my second son, and nothing bad happened." Mrs. Lu rolled her eyes. "My daughter is different. She is the granddaughter of a scholar. She has been studying and practicing calligraphy since she was a child. I don't want her to do that kind of work." Lin Pinger said loudly, taking a deep breath. Mrs. Lu kept arguing, but Bai Hong cut her off. "Mom, are you done eating? If so, we'll clear the table." Mrs. Lu rolled her eyes, immediately shutting up and rushing back to the table to finish her meal. The whole scene had soured the mood for everyone. Bai Ruozhu, his face still tight with anger, said, "Mom, Dad, I'm going back to my studies." Lin Pinger waved him off. Mrs. Lu, her mouth full, mumbled, "Erlang, you study hard now. I know you'll pass the exam." Bai Ruozhu and Bai Ruozhu were the top students in their generation, handpicked by the scholars outside the city. "Thank you, Grandma," Bai Ruozhu said coolly, then left. Bai Ruozhu, afraid Mrs. Lu would grill him about the trip to town, said quickly, "I'm going to check on the fields." With that, he took off. Mrs. Lu had polished off most of the food, except for the amaranth she didn't like. She dropped her bowl and chopsticks, belching loudly. Lin Pinger made a face and started clearing the table. Mrs. Lu sidled up to Bai Hong, whispering, "Second son, you're much more honest than your wife. Tell me, what's Ruozhu been up to?" Bai Hong was mortified. His face grew strained. "Mom, I honestly don't know. The kids are grown, they have their own lives. Lu's eyes widened. You don't see me as your mother anymore, is that it? Bai Hong nearly fell off his stool. He sputtered, Mom, I swear, I really don't know. Ruozhu never tells me anything. Chapter 29. The eldest brother's marriage is about to get dirty. You are listening at novelfull.audio. You're her own dad. And she still won't tell you? Mrs. Lu's eyes widened, then she smirked. Don't tell me you've been messing around with some random woman, huh? You knock her up, and she can't even tell me? If you don't put a stop to this, just look at the fine daughter you've raised. Bai Hong, normally the most dutiful son, snapped. He stared at Mrs. Lu, disbelief etched on his face. Mom, is that really how a grandma should talk? Ruozhu being pregnant is a delicate thing. Do you even think about who might overhear you saying stuff like that? Mrs. Lu just rolled her eyes. What are you yelling about? Have you forgotten I'm your mother? And who's going to overhear gossip? I heard the gossip, that's why I'm here. Just then, Lin Pinger came back in from doing the dishes. She overheard the tail end of the conversation and blew a gasket. Mom, I respect you as an elder, but you can't go around bad-mouthing my daughter. What outsiders say is their business. You're her grandmother, how can you repeat that trash? Are you trying to ruin the family name? Lin Pinger was furious, smoothing down her clothes. I'm going to the old house and asking Dad if those are the standards we live by now. Mrs. Lu had snuck over, hoping to keep things quiet. If Lin Pinger went running to the old man, she'd be in serious trouble. She immediately plastered on a fake smile and said, why can't family talk among themselves? I'm just worried about Ruozhu. I want to get to the bottom of this so I can have something to tell the neighbors. Mom, don't. My Ruozhu is a good girl, well-raised and respectable. I have no reason to worry. Bai Hong said, clearly annoyed. Meanwhile, Bai Ruozhu had whipped up some boiled shrimp and was happily munching on them with vinegar in her room, savoring every bite. She had her ears pricked, listening to the commotion in the main room, and couldn't help but roll her eyes. That woman is such a piece of work, that when she was almost finished, she mentally zipped the shrimp shells and the vinegar bowl back into her personal dimension. She was realizing new advantages of the dimension all the time. She could stash stuff in it from outside and grab stuff out of the pond whenever she wanted. A few minutes later, Mrs. Lu stomped out of the main room, still muttering under her breath. As she passed by Ruozhu's window, she stopped dead and sniffed the air. Hey, what's that smell? Something besides vinegar? Could it be that Bai Ruozhu was cooking on the sly? Thinking she was onto something, Mrs. Lu tiptoed to the window, silently edged it open a crack, and peered inside. She saw Bai Ruozhu sleeping soundly, her belly so big she could only lie on her side. Mrs. Lu was confused. Could I have smelled it wrong? Maybe she just likes the smell of vinegar and drinks it. Mrs. Lu curled her lip and stalked out of the yard. Sour and spicy, huh? Bet that girl is carrying a boy. Too good for her, if you ask me. Bai Ruozhu heard the slam of the courtyard gate after Mrs. Lu left and finally let out a sigh of relief. That was a close one. She's such a busybody. The thought made her tired, and she drifted back to sleep. When she woke up, the yard was quiet. Her older brother didn't seem to be gardening in the back, and her mother didn't appear to be feeding the pigs. The pigs were hungry and squealing, that was unusual. Her mother never let the pigs go hungry. She was always trying to fatten them up so they'd bring in more money. Bai Ruozhu slowly got up, gently opened the door, and stepped outside. She heard voices in the main room, hushed and low. She crept closer, straining to hear. It was her parents talking, and her mother sounded like she was crying. Was it because Grandma came over? Bai Ruozhu worried that the old woman had soured the family's mood, but then she heard her mother's voice, laced with bitterness. I said from the start that marrying into Wang Qi's family was a step too high for us, but you didn't listen. You insisted they genuinely liked our oldest. Look where we are now. The matchmaker has made it clear she won't be back a second time. She's obviously avoiding me. Bai Ruozhu sighed. Maybe something really came up. Try not to overthink it. Let's give it a little more time. Things will be different once your second brother gets his scholar's degree. Lin Ping'er sniffled. How can it always be a coincidence? They didn't even invite me in. They used to ask me in for tea whenever they came by, but now they're avoiding me. Bai Ruozhu frowned. He remembered that the village chief had asked him to discuss the school, and Elder Wang was there. He had even greeted Elder Wang, who was polite, but in retrospect, that politeness felt distant. Let's just wait and see. Don't say anything to your oldest brother about this yet. Bai Ruozhu sighed again. I know, I won't. Lin Ping'er's voice was muffled, her nose clogged from crying. Bai Ruozhu walked out of the yard, feeling like her legs were made of jelly. Her heart ached. Although the mess ultimately originated from her predecessor, she still felt responsible. Her family was so good to her, had never been unhappy because of her, and they were just showering her with love and trust. She truly saw them as her family, and she wanted everyone to be happy. I hope my parents stay in love and healthy. I hope my second brother passes his exam and becomes a scholar. I hope my older brother marries his sweetheart soon and they have a happy life together. And I hope I can give them a nephew soon, so I can watch him play with the baby I'm carrying. Those were her immediate wishes, but thanks to a bunch of ugly rumors, her family was being affected. Her older brother was a proud man. If he heard about this, he'd probably call off the wedding with the Wang girl. But, according to the original Ruozhu's memories, he was really fond of Wang Kaiyue. That was why her mother was so happy to get the dowry stuff ready. But what now? Bai Ruozhu wandered around the village and spotted several women gossiping in the distance. She noticed that one of them was Lu San's daughter-in-law, who had a bone to pick with her, and she quickly ducked behind a tree. Didn't you hear? They said before that Bai Ruozhu's man came back and made his fortune, but who saw him moving into Bai Ruozhu's house? He's still not even considered a son-in-law. Why hasn't he just moved in? Lu San's daughter-in-law said with a nasty smirk. That's right, what's really going on? Another meddlesome woman asked eagerly. Lu San's daughter-in-law puffed up with pride, a hint of disdain on her face. You haven't heard? They say that Changsheng already has a wife, and Bai Ruozhu is just his mistress. The real wife won't let her in. It's a real shame for the family, and Bai Lauer is too embarrassed to admit it. So they made up some story about him getting married and something tragic happening to him on the way. What? Someone gasped. We may be poor farmers, but we're not going to settle for being someone's mistress. Someone else immediately agreed. Yeah, being a mistress is the lowest of the low. Chapter 30. Some people spread rumors and others add to the trouble. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The people here are simple and honest, especially in a place like Househan village. Villagers almost never take concubines. Back then, people saw concubines as even lower than servants, unrecognized by the main wife and just used on the sly by the man. Keeping one on the side was no better than a streetwalker. Bai Ruozhu probably didn't really grasp what an outer room meant, so she wasn't too upset by Lu San's wife's words. She just quietly walked away. Her old self, even if she hadn't gotten furious at what Lu San's wife said, would have probably jumped at her and fought her to the death. Now, Bai Ruozhu knew what being labeled an outer room meant. It would reflect poorly on her parents and brothers, and even the child she was carrying would face prejudice from day one. No way. She couldn't let that happen. Bai Ruozhu decided not to hang around in the village any longer. As she headed home, she ran into Fang Guizhi nearby. Ruozhu, why are you out here by yourself? Fang Guizhi looked anxious, worried that she had also heard the rumors. Bai Ruozhu gave a wry smile. Guizhi, you know what people are saying around here, right? If you consider me a friend, tell me right away if something like this comes up again. Don't keep things from me. I was afraid you'd get mad, Fan Guizhi stammered, blushing. She hadn't wanted to keep it from Bai Ruozhu, but she was afraid of upsetting her. What else could she do? Bai Ruozhu took Fan Guizhi's hand, her tone softening. Guizhi, I'm not blaming you. I just want to know what's happening as soon as possible, so I can figure out how to handle things. I'm different now. I won't fly off the handle just because of some gossip. Fan Guizhi nodded eagerly. Okay, then there's something I should tell you. Oh. Bai Ruozhu felt like she was really smart. Her timing was perfect. Otherwise, she would have missed out on some important news. She remembered that Fan Guizhi was always running errands for her mother. She got out and about a lot, and because she was young, people didn't hold back when talking around her. So she often heard gossip in the village, but she didn't spread it. At most, she would secretly tell her friend Bai Ruozhu. It's about your older brother. The Wang family might be backing out of the marriage, Fan Guizhi said, watching Bai Ruozhu carefully. Seeing that she wasn't too surprised, she hurried on. Did you already know? Bai Ruozhu nodded. I overheard my parents talking. Mom was pretty upset. She sighed heavily. Fan Guizhi often went to Bai Ruozhu's house, and Bai Ruozhu's mother always treated her well, sharing food and helping her mend clothes. Because of that, Fan Guizhi really liked her. She even dreamed more than once what it would be like if Lin Pinger was her mother, so hearing that Lin Pinger was crying about this made Fan Guizhi feel really bad. Guizhi, did you hear anything else? What about the Wangs? Bai Ruozhu had her own thoughts. Forcing things wasn't the way to go. If the Wangs really weren't a good fit, it would be better to call things off sooner rather than later. Actually, Wang Kaiwe is a nice woman, and she loves her daughter just as much as your mother loves you. She agreed to the marriage because she wanted what was best for her daughter. Families like theirs don't usually agree to that sort of arrangement. Fan Guizhi sounded envious. She really wished she had a mother who loved her that much. But Kaiwe and her mother are overprotective. When they heard the rumors about you, they worried that your family wasn't respectable, and her daughter would be treated badly. That's why she pulled back and didn't want to meet with your mother. Bai Ruozhu didn't know what to say. The Wangs were right to care about their daughter. But from Bai Ruozhu's point of view, she thought they were too easily swayed by gossip. But I heard that Sayue's father still wants the marriage to happen. It's just that the women are in charge of the details, so it's hard for him to get involved. I walked by the Wang's house yesterday and heard them arguing about it, Fan Guizhi added. No wonder Fan Guizhi knew so much. Bai Ruozhu nodded slightly. It seemed that the problem was with Wang Sayue's mother. She probably wasn't a bad person, just overly cautious and worried about her daughter's future. Looks like those rumors need to die down before Wang Kaiwe and her mother will change their minds, Bai Ruozhu sighed. If Changxing was here, the rumors would disappear. But where was he? This was the first time Bai Ruozhu looked forward to Changxing's return, not just for the baby, but for the sake of her family. It's Lu San's wife who's been running her mouth. Why don't you go to the village chief and tell on her? Let him settle things, Fan Guizhi suggested. Bai Ruozhu shook her head. The village chief has enough problems without getting involved in this kind of nonsense. Besides, I have no proof that Lu San's wife is spreading rumors. And who's to say it isn't true? It could backfire. Fan Guizhi pouted. So what are we going to do? We can't just let her say whatever she wants, can we? Bai Ruozhu didn't have any ideas. Plus, she was pregnant and tired from standing for so long. I'm going home. I'll let you know when I think of something. You should get back to work before your mom yells at you. Fan Guizhi smacked her forehead. Oh, I gotta run. She took off. As soon as Bai Ruozhu got home, her mother scolded her for wandering off without saying anything. Lin Pinger also asked her a few questions, but Bai Ruozhu didn't want to mention that she had overheard her parents' conversation, so Lin Ping'er assumed her daughter had just wanted some fresh air. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Lin Ping'er seemed preoccupied and barely spoke. Bai Ruozhu glanced at her older brother, who looked normal. He probably didn't know that the Wangs were having second thoughts. Seeing her brother's kind, honest face made Bai Ruozhu feel even worse. After the meal, Bai Zipei went back to his room to study, while Bai Ruozhu went outside to relax. But then, an unexpected guest showed up. "Hey, folks. Just checking in. I was worried you might be upset, so I came to cheer you up." It was Bai Ruozhu's aunt, Mrs. Wang. She shouted the moment she walked in, as if she wanted the whole neighborhood to hear her, you know, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. "Auntie, please keep it down. You're gonna distract my brother. He's studying for the exam. People might not know that you have such a loud voice. We don't need any more gossip that you're jealous of him if he passes the exam." Bai Ruozhu spotted Wang in the yard first. Mrs. Wang's expression changed. If she didn't admit she had a loud voice, it would look like she was deliberately disturbing Bai Zipei's studies and that she was small-minded. But if she did admit it, wouldn't that make her seem rude?